I'm sure that we have all read super closely the story of the Akedah. After all, it is central to who we are as a Jewish people. We read it twice a year. We've talked already this morning that it's a super, super, super short narrative, right around 300 words, depending on how you count. And it's really focused. And in many ways, we can call it a text of terror because in it we have Abraham who's about to sacrifice his kid. And I don't know about you, I know me as a parent, every once in a while, I may want to sacrifice one of my kids just so that there's some quiet in the house, but it's not something that I would ever actually do. And so the idea that Abraham is about to engage and do this thing that somehow Isaac hasn't figured out. Neither have the Na'aravs who are with him, the youths that are there with him, but maybe they did. Maybe if we put our imaginary caps on, we can kind of think that, yeah, somebody knew something was about to go down, and I don't think it was very good what was about to go down. Now the question is, were they going to speak up? And I ask this of you also. So when we think about the youths who were there, they were servants. They were present. Did they feel that they could speak up? And I say this because so many times I don't think we think that people can speak up. But let's think about some truths that we all kind of live with. And I ask you, have you spoken up? Have you brought it to someone's attention? Have you worn white after Labor Day? And did you point it out to somebody? What about something else that's really important? One of those rules that you never break in your own life, like don't sit in your father's special chair when you were a kid. I'm sure there were other rules too that you knew about, like don't cut up the National Geographic until everybody in the house looked at it. That was one of the rules I had to live with. And what about if you have a family member who's dating somebody that's, let's say, not appropriate for a variety of reasons, or maybe you see that that person is potentially abusive. At that point, do you speak up? What about if you are aware that somebody in your life is engaging in infidelity? Do you tell the other person in that relationship? What do we do if we see child abuse or somebody destroying the environment? Then do we speak up? And I think we have to ask, at what point is it our obligation to speak up? Do we feel safe enough to speak up? And how do we have those moments? Just as it's our obligation sometimes to speak up, like you would have thought maybe the Na'arav in the story of the Akedah would have spoken up, sometimes we also have to ask, when is it okay for us to be silent? And in Judaism, I think we have to keep that in mind too. That sometimes it's great. We all have ideas. I don't know if you've ever been in a room with a whole bunch of Jews. I'm sure all of you have at some point or another. There's a lot of noise with everybody sharing their opinions. But there are those spaces in the Jewish world where we don't share opinions. In fact, we're silent. Can anybody think of anything? Okay, a Shiva house. When you go into a Shiva house, traditionally, you don't speak. In fact, when the person is mourning, you don't speak to them unless they speak to you first. What about those moments when you're sitting there and you're looking at somebody and they're wearing something that's, well, not exactly what you would say looking good at, but they feel very happy in their outfit? Do you speak up then? I'm guessing no. You probably want to hold back on those emotions just for a second. Maybe it's not a great idea to blurt out exactly what you're thinking at that moment. And sometimes when you're in business negotiations or other things, thinking deliberately and taking your time to hear all of the options presented may actually afford you a better business deal. So sometimes it's about being able to read the room further and see if the person that you are speaking with is able and ready to hear you. Maybe your opinion, well, as awesome as it is, and right as it is, may not be what's needed at that moment to be stated. So sometimes silence is important. And when we look at the Na'arav, maybe they were focusing on the fact that silence was important, that this was a moment between Abraham and Isaac, one that they shouldn't intervene with. And yet on the flip side of that same coin, there are moments when we have to speak up. We ourselves individually need to make sure our feelings, our thoughts, our ideas are not about to be trampled on. And we have to speak up in those moments. We also, I think, as Jews, have an obligation to speak up for those who are marginalized in our society, those for whom there is no one to speak up for, those for whom their voices are often neglected and often not heard. It is at those moments that we must speak up, that we are called to speak up. Not about, whether or not somebody's outfit looks right, but whether or not somebody's rights are being trampled on. Are the rights of women in this country being trampled on? What about systemic racism? What about the environment when nobody's necessarily speaking up for the earth? Those are moments when I think it is incumbent upon us to start to think about speaking up and doing that. But what about, in 2021? Well, let's admit it. Sometimes speaking up is hard to do. I don't know about you, but I've had a few Zoom glitches over my life during the pandemic, and some of them have just been fun. Right when you're about to speak up at the most inopportune moment and you glitch out. But I'm not talking about those hard moments. I'm talking about other moments that can also be hard. What about when you find something on the news that triggers you and is upsetting? And it's just simply hard to express to those around you why that particular news story was upsetting, what was challenging about it, and why maybe sharing it or discussing it can be just a little bit hard for you at that moment. You may need a few minutes to cool down. What about in power dynamic relationships when you are subordinate and somebody's above you, but they're about to engage in something dangerous for either you, them, or the company that you work for? Then it's also very hard. And yet sometimes I find it, although all those conversations, especially in the workplace, are important, but need to be done with delicate hands and thoughtful intentions and words. We also have challenging conversations when we think about social stigma issues like sexual orientation, gender identification, if you have an STI or not, if you're jobless, how you lost your job, going through a divorce. All of these things can place stigma on people, and while they may need to discuss it and want to discuss it, because of those stigmas, it's very hard to do as a society. And this is where I would say, as a society, it's our obligation to start to listen. One of those last conversations that I think are really hard, sometimes it's just not worth it. If you know the other person is simply not going to be engaged, not going to listen, then is the argument really worth it? I want to take a few words or thoughts from John Gottman. He's a marriage and family therapist, and he has a whole institute. And he talks about 7 effective tools for those end-of-the-day conversations with your spouse. And I don't think, though, that it's applicable only to those end-of-the-day important conversations with your spouse, which the ideal goal would be that it's de-stressing. I think, though, that in a time, in an era where we find ourselves to be more and more polarized, where we have to ask, when is it appropriate to speak up? When is it appropriate to remain silent? And how can I bridge this gap with a person in front of me who has a very different political view than I do? And yet we as a society need to be able to listen and hear each other. We as a society need to be able to speak up when appropriate and respond appropriately like adults. So I want to suggest that some of the tools that he has for interpersonal relations between a couple can actually be applicable in those other moments as well. He says that we need to take turns in having those conversations, that it's sometimes appropriate to be quiet, and it's sometimes appropriate to take your turn and speak up. But by overpowering the other person with your opinion, you're not allowing that person's opinion to be spoken nor heard. That you need to have compassion, not only for yourself, but for the person in front of you. After all, maybe having a conversation this day with this topic is very hard, and you won't know that unless you are having compassion for them. Don't provide unsolicited solutions. Sometimes it's not good to say, I know the answer, ask me. Well, you might be right. If it's unsolicited, it's not going to be heard by the other person. And you may be right about everything that's going on politically in this country. Again, if they're not interested in hearing it, they're not going to do it, regardless of how accurate and correct you are. Express your understanding and validate the other person's emotions. Sometimes it's really good to do mirrored listening and hearing back and forth to make sure the other person feels heard. It's always important, he suggests, to take your partner's side. Well, that's not always possible when you're having dialogue with other persons, when you're speaking up or when you're being quiet. Sometimes you just can't take the other person's side because you disagree. In those specific cases, you can, though, make sure that the other person's side is honored and respected and not denigrated. Lastly, he suggests to be, and this is really, I think, for interpersonal couples, but adopt a we against them attitude and be affectionate. And I'm not suggesting that you go and be affectionate with some strangers that you're having difficult conversations with, but what I am suggesting is that while it's easy for us to want to avoid those hard conversations, it's easy for us not to want to speak up sometimes because we don't believe that the outcome is going to justify the effort that is needed to put into that conversation. After all, we were told by our parents, at least I was told by mine, don't have an argument with a fool. The point, though, I think in these conversations is it's a dance. It's a dance just as it was for the youths in the story of Abraham. When do they speak up? When are they quiet? When do we speak up? When are we quiet? How do we engage in those difficult conversations? And how can those conversations help elevate us as a community? Let's perhaps think about from the perspective of the Na'ar once again, as we return there. It was a challenging moment for them. They knew that potentially Isaac most likely was not going to come down off Mount Moriah. And yet they also understood that this was something between Abraham and Isaac. I'm not sure what I would have done if I were one of the Na'arav. I'm not sure if I would have spoken up or not. Maybe I would have hinted at Isaac that, hey, your dad's about to off you. But maybe not either. And yet we're confronted often by these challenging points and inflection moments in our lives. And when do we speak up? When are we silent? Is silence better? And is speaking up better? And so while I encourage all of you to contemplate this in the coming year, hopefully these thoughts on when do we speak up and how do we speak up will help renew your relationships with those people who really you need that deeper connection, and help make this year one which you have deep, honest relationships with others, full of compassion for yourself and for the other person. And lastly, a year which you're able to bring both yourself and the other person whom you are engaged in these important conversations with a sense of joy, wholeness, and peace. As together we say, Amen.